I'll start with karakia and then we can start our session. So, e noi tātou, e te atua, e tēnei wā, kia tau te rangamari, kia ranga e ngā iwi, i te ao, o te ao, āmini.
Āmini.
So, welcome, and particularly welcome to you, Matt. You were a member of the NZDSN whānau, being the NZDSN policy lead for a couple of years. So welcome back.
Look, it's a pleasure. Thanks, Debbie.
You're very welcome, and it's great to have you. And of course, Brian, I know you've been a long-standing supporter of NZDSN, so thank you very much both for coming. So just a little bit of housekeeping. So this is NZDSN Fireside Chat, which means it is recorded and put on our website for members who may not have had the opportunity to get to the session today and have the opportunity to re-watch it. So that's a reminder to you both, Matt and Brian, and also to all the members online today that the session is recorded and will be loaded onto the members portal on the NZDSN website. This is the fourth Fireside Chat that NZDSN has hosted. Most interesting and linked to this Fireside Chat, we've also talked about the Royal Commission recommendations on the inquiry into the abuse of care, and had a really informative session with some of your colleagues from Whaikaha, Ben and Esther. And that was a really interesting session, and we talked about the recommendations and the work that Whaikaha was doing to implement those. And obviously there was a link with the UNCRPD work that we talked about at the time. And then we had a session on safeguarding, what DSS was doing around standing up services, around safeguarding, that basically spoke to those recommendations from the Royal Commission. Another really important part that we wanted to cover was the UNCRPD, and most particularly the conversation that we know that is happening out in the sector about institutionalisation and the recommendations from the UN that relate to those discussions. So I think this is a really useful session for members. Really interesting to cover those areas. So look, I'll hand over to you both so you can introduce yourself, and then we'll go from there.
Thanks, Debbie. Kia ora, everyone. It's lovely to be back. As Debbie says, I had the real pleasure and privilege of being the NZDSN policy lead for a couple of years. I'm Matt Frost. I've been in public service, and in fact, NZDSN was my last role before I took the plunge into public service. I am a principal advisor in our outreach and innovation team here, and my main work program at the moment is kind of twofold. So I lead on our international engagement. So our work with MFAT, which intersects into different rights frameworks, and we'll explore that a little bit after Mātua Brian introduces himself. And then the other part of my role is I do have an interest in specialisation in this particular treaty, the UNCRPD. It's a really innovative treaty from my point of view, and I think one of the things that is most interesting about it is Article 19, living independently in the community, and we'll explore why that is a little bit, and then go from there. I think my biggest advice and takeaway for this session would be it's really easy to see the convention and its articles in isolation. I hope that during the conversation we see it broadly, and that there's an opportunity to see this as a mover and shifter for practice. So I'll let Brian introduce himself.
Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi mahana kia koutou. Warm greetings. I'm Brian Coffey. I'm the Chief Advisor at Whaikaha, Chief Advisor to the Chief Executive. And I'm here because actually I've been at both examinations where the UN committee has examined New Zealand's progress against the convention. So really look forward to this discussion. And I think the takeaway I would add is kind of complemented to Matt is I see lots of people writing that compliance with the convention. Yeah, it feels like a lot of rules, but I think what we want to get is commitment to the principles of the convention and for that to drive practice rather than see this as a compliance activity. Because I don't think when disabled people worked so hard to get the convention accepted and implemented, they were looking for people to do the minimum. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, certainly from NZDSN's perspective, the importance of the convention is a really important topic at the moment, because I think it really helps drive where largely the disability sector is aiming to go, isn't it? It's a really important vehicle for us to use, not to mention it's the tool to ensure that disabled people have their rights realised in the same way that everybody else. And that's a really important thing, isn't it? To be promoting. Can you give us an overview of the UNCRPD and the work that's going on?
Sure, TV, no worries. So Matt here. So I want to start from a slightly different place, if I may. I really like the framing of the Fireside Chat. And of course, the framing of Fireside Chat comes from Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt did Fireside Chats in the 1930s and 1940s. And the reason why that's relevant to this conversation is that after World War II, his wife, Eleanor, headed the first UN Committee on Human Rights and helped to frame the Universal Declaration on Human Rights in 1948. And that's important for a starting place because disabled people have always had the rights that were framed in that first document in the Universal Declaration in 1948. They had the right to liberty, security, safety of person, right? They were always, those rights were always available to disabled people. But what the framework recognises, and the CRPD works within a suite of conventions. So it's not just a convention on its own. There is, people may be aware of UNCROP, which is the Convention on the Rights of the Child, CEDAW, which is the Convention on the Rights of Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. So it sits within that framework of instruments that recognise that for some groups, those universal rights have not been played out as effectively as we would like. So the UNCRPD was developed in the early 2000s. It was first mooted in the 1990s, and New Zealand played a really key leadership role in its development. And one of the things about the UNCRPD was that it was one of the quickest human rights treaties ratified in UN speak. And when I say quick, I mean 8 years, which doesn't sound that quick. But actually, when you're dealing with a range of states, that is quite quick. And one of the things that is most powerful about the UNCRPD is that it was a very much a joint piece of work with officials and disabled people. And that comes through in a couple of ways. So the first way that comes through is through the principles of the convention, which are in Article 3 of the convention, which basically outlines what are the things that are kind of core to how it works. And those principles are dignity and autonomy, non-discrimination, full and effective participation, respect for difference, equality of opportunity, accessibility, equality between men and women, and respect for children's evolving capacities. So they're kind of the things that if you had to describe the convention in a kind of elevator pitch,
Yep.
which is used a lot in public service, that's how you would frame it, right? So bring us on to the 2022 examination. The way in which the treaty's implementation is monitored. There's a couple of avenues. So at the domestic level, we have the independent monitoring mechanism, which is 3 groups. So that's the DPO Coalition, the Office of the Ombudsman, and the Human Rights Commission. And at the international level, there is a committee on the rights of persons with disabilities, and that committee has 18 members from all around the world, who are seen as independent experts. So, and they truly are independent. So they can't be connected to government. They are independent experts in their own right, and they are an impressive group of people. The range of experts that were there, and so New Zealand, there's a kind of roster of when countries are examined, and our last examination was in 2022, and Brian and I were fortunate enough and privileged enough to go to that examination, an exercise which I described as a mix between a select committee and a PhD examination. It really is. It's one of the most intense things I think I've ever been through. Yeah. And what came from that was 63 what's known as concluding observations or recommendations. And I think the framing of concluding observation is really important. So they're observations from the committee. They are guides to best practice. They read in an international law way, like quite formal recommendations, but they really are designed to be a spur to better practice, and that's how we saw the 2022 examination. The other thing I should say is the examination, the other challenging bits about the examination is it covers a whole range of areas. So it covers the whole range of the convention. So you need to have levels of expertise across the subject matter areas. And so we took a delegation of 6 or 7 to Geneva. So things like living independently in the community is one part of the broader convention conversation. I guess why this conversation matters now is that there's a couple of reasons. One is seeing the work on living independently in the community is really core to the implementation of the convention. So when the convention was being developed, there's a story that's kind of gone around the traps a bit, which is that officials, the government officials who were negotiating the convention, when disabled people's organisations came, and they really pushed for an article about living independently in the community, the officials were like, well, why would you need that? Because everybody lives in the community. So there's nobody that doesn't live, in the community. You kind of live in your house, and the disabled people's organisations were really strong in saying, well, no, actually, that's not our reality. That's not a reality for lots of disabled people. And so for this to be meaningful for us, we need to have an explicit argument, an explicit article around what living independently looks like. And so Article 19 talks a lot about what does living independently look like in terms of service provision, but also what could be reasonable expectations around the access to community. So I guess that's a kind of general overview of how the treaty works. One other thing which I think is useful here is that there are certain articles in the convention that can't be what's called progressively realised, which is there are certain things which states need to do now, right? And those are things like you have the absolute right to not be tortured, for example, because if you think about it, if you try to progressively realise a right against torture, if you say, well, you've got a little bit of wiggle room on torture, that never ends well. But
Right.
there are, so those are called civil and political rights. And then there are rights that are economic, social, and cultural. So those are rights like education, health, work, employment. Those are, and there's a realization that because this goes across countries around the world, that will take time to implement, and also around practice. So it will take time for good practice to innovate itself out. So the principle that's applied there is a principle called progressive realisation, which means you can't go back. So New Zealand, having signed up to the convention, if we were to go back to taking an extreme example, if we were to go back to institutional models of the 1970s, that would be going squarely against the convention we had signed up to. And we are able to say, look, we have a certain amount of resource that we can promote to particular economic, social, and cultural rights. And living independently in the community, there's quite an interesting discussion about the intersection between whether that's a civil and political right and an economic, social, and cultural right. I think we're finding it more in the economic, social, and cultural area. So that's a really important kind of overview for this conversation.
Nice.
So, Brian.
I think the only thing that I would add is like the UN doesn't have at times a lot of respect, and what would they know about things in New Zealand? And so always a reminder that the committee acts on advice from disabled people in New Zealand. So they provide a report to the convention, to the committee, and that report that they provide then influences the way that they examine officials at the examination. And they're also kind of gathering evidence from all of the examinations they're doing and looking for trends and issues internationally that need to be prioritised.
Yeah.
I've got to say, New Zealand is seen as quite progressive. It may not feel like that to us when we live in New Zealand, but we're seen as quite progressive and leaders in this space. So that actually means we probably get dealt with in a harder way at the convention, because they're trying to push us to push others on, and also recognition that economically, again, it might not feel like we're doing too well. Well, we're doing a lot better than a lot of other countries, and we have resources that we can apply to these issues so that other countries don't. So I think we accept with respect that the committee is harder on countries like New Zealand.
Doing well. So how does, so we've got the domestic and the independent monitoring domestically, and you've said that that's a report largely from disabled people to the convention, and that's what guides what gets asked. How is that something that, like, do all disabled people contribute to that process, or how does that get generated? And
that's a really good question, Debbie. So on the at the examination, anyone can provide feedback to the committee about the position that New Zealand is in. So the committee will call for submissions from organisations and individuals, and indeed they did for our examination. And one of the ways in which that played out was that the DPO Coalition, which is a group of 7 disabled people's organisations, wrote what's known as a shadow report. So the New Zealand government got to write a report that basically said this is what our position is. The committee took that report. It also called for what's known as civil society reports, and it's really important to note that that can be done by anybody. So for example, at the next examination, NZDSN could produce a report to feed into the committee process. So anybody is able to feed into that process. What I would say is that in terms of what we did to continue good practice was after the examination in 2022, so part of the process is a cycle, but often it can stop at the examination. So in terms of implementation, in 2014, for example, what we did was we stopped. We did a report after 6 months, and then follow-up was a little bit patchy. So what we decided to do this time was write a response that was agreed by the Cabinet. And so the Cabinet agreed a response from the previous government, and this government modified its response. But that's quite unique in the UN context, to get the full Cabinet to agree to the response. And the lovely thing is that now the Ministry of Justice has what's known as the Human Rights Monitor, which is where all the reports from all of the conventions, the human rights-based conventions, you can go and you can look up, and we'll put a link in the chat to that monitor, so people can see what the various responses of government are and that's a really helpful thing for human rights monitoring and oversight overall, I think. So members are welcome to go at any point to have a look at that. Brian?
I mean, I think, again, one of the unique things that New Zealand does is we actually fund civil society to produce that report. And through the DPO Coalition, we fund them so that they can do a report on a focused area of the convention. And of course, those things accumulate over time to feed into the examination. We were getting worried that we weren't going to get examined at all in 2021. And so we did a unique thing as well in preparation. It was quite useful. I'm not sure whether we'll do it again. As we said, well, why do we have to wait to go to the UN to be examined by civil society on the progress we were making? So we offered the opportunity and resourced a 2-day kind of like select committee where the IMM, and it was online, took officials in the government apart over 2 days in terms of the progress being made. We ran it just like the examination runs, but officials had to turn up, and they had to respond to the questions around the various parts of the convention that were most relevant to their agency.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. Yeah. So, what are the current priorities for Whaikaha around the convention? What's your work program on this piece of work?
So I think the thing that's really been, and Matt's already alluded to us, is how do you maintain commitment on something where you're not going to be examined until 2030? Like, it's very easy to say, well, okay, we'll do something in 2029. So we didn't do this the last time, eh? This time we thought actually to get agency commitment, we'll go to the highest committee in the land to agree on what will be progressed. And as Matt said, we got that through the previous government at the end of 2022, and then did an update with the current government in 2020. The end of start of this year.
Sorry, you go.
And so that gave us the opportunity. It's kind of risky to get it in front of Cabinet, but it actually means that once that decision is made by Cabinet, then agencies are kind of committed to doing it, and we'll use the ministerial leadership group. That's not a it's not a legislated subcommittee of Cabinet, but it will be there as a mechanism to monitor progress.
Yeah, and one of the things that was really important about the response, and it leads nicely into, I think, the main topic that members are interested in here, which is around living independently in institutions, was we were clear that government agencies needed to be responsible for the areas that they were responsible for. So, for example, we couldn't just leave the whole implementation of the convention and the UNCRPD to Whaikaha, because that just wouldn't work. So what we did was we said, look, for the education-based recommendations, they are the responsibility of the Ministry of Education. For questions about disability support, of course, as members will know, up until last year, they sat with us. They now sit with DSS. So the questions around living independently in the community mainly sit with DSS, and they provided a response around the range of service provision. I guess one of the things that's been really interesting in this space has been how, and I know that one of the questions you put, Debbie, was how do we define what an institution is? And it's a really interesting question. So this is not so much how Whaikaha defines but it's more around how the UN itself defines it. And it's not, one of the really interesting things is it's not based on setting. Like, it's not actually based on, it's based on certain common elements, and that things can look different depending on context. So, but things like isolation and segregation from community life, supervision of living arrangements without consent, rigidity of routine, those kind of elements are things that the UN considers to be based around institutions and what institutional stuff might look like. I think it is important to add at this point that the UN has to deal with a whole range of countries' provision, right? So it's having to meet a kind of medium around and what practice looks like. So I guess one of the things that we were thinking about was the use of those kind of criteria for members to consider what does that look like in their own settings. So Brian, did you have a point?
Before we go, exactly, I'll just give you some numbers that's quite important. So there's 15 agencies that have got lead responsibilities on the recommendations. There's 30 recommendations that Cabinet has agreed will be progressed now. And as Matt said, they are up on the Ministry of Justice Human Rights Monitoring Framework. So there'll be public reporting on the progress of those recommendations. There's 17 recommendations that the Cabinet agreed could be looked at through the New Zealand Disability Strategy. So, you know, why if we've got that mechanism, let's also use that to progress some of the recommendations. And then there are a remaining 16 recommendations that no work is committed to be done on some of those things. You know, the one that often sits in there is the immigration one and the test of good health. So that recommendation is made each time, and every government says, no, we're not going to progress that one. So, and I think this is better than kind of nodding at the end of it and saying, yes, we'll progress everything. And then I think it's better to be upfront and be honest around where we are going to make progress and be held accountable on those things. Yep.
Absolutely.
Hey, should we stop and see if there's any questions at the moment, Debbie, before we move on to the second part?
Yeah, absolutely.
Do
If
that?
you've got any questions, can raise your hand. No, nothing from the members, so we're doing well.
All
We'll
right.
keep on tracking on through. So, I think one of the things that we talked about was the recent, oh no, I've just gone, I lost you, hold on. Was the recent announcement from the government around increased support to residential services in New Zealand. And most members know, and I'm sure you know, that DSS is implementing a new commissioning process for residential care through a panel process, and is implementing a pricing model for community group homes, and that's a group home model. And there are positive reasons for that model being developed, like national consistency and ensuring disabled people get the services that they need. But nevertheless, in looking in the wider conversation, when we're hearing about the UNCRPD talking about reducing institutions or 5-bedroom homes, and we're seeing in another part of government, a longer-term payment framework being stood up. How does that all land, and how should providers kind of see that as we watch that happen?
Okay. This is a very good question, and I'm still not sure how I'm going to answer it, but I'll give it a go.
In
the end, the governments make decisions about the amount of funding that they'll make available and the approaches to that. And so, once those decisions are made, then that's something that we have to work with. Okay, every country has to do that. I mean, everyone would like a lot more money in order to progress the convention much faster. But the defence of that is, but we should still be considering the spirit of what the institutionalisation is about. So a quick advert here. The Global Leadership Exchange, like, I didn't know, I forgot about this, that we contributed to a paper by the Global Leadership Exchange on deinstitutionalisation. So I just got a draft of it to provide feedback. And I got it 2 days ago. It dropped into my inbox, so that was very convenient. And that paper will be available at the end of October after we've provided some feedback on it. So this is under the Global Leadership Exchange, not under Whaikaha, right? I think that paper will be really good to have a discussion about once that's available. But it starts out with saying deinstitutionalisation is not merely the closure of large residential care facilities, but the creation of a system where people with disabilities are valued as equals, supported to live independently, are able to more easily participate in the community, and empowered to contribute to their communities. And those challenges are significant, but so too are the possibilities. And so those things can be progressed in 5-bedroom residences. And so that's what we would say is, government makes some decisions. We've got the convention. Actually, how do we give effect to the convention, even within that context? So those decisions don't stop us thinking innovatively about how we implement the spirit of the convention and the spirit of deinstitutionalisation. That would be sad if that was the case, because none of the progress that's been made so far over the 40, 50 years would have been made if we were waiting for government, if we were waiting for officials to give the go ahead. And I think, you know, the providers have a lot of power, I think, to implement these recommendations. Acknowledge how hard it can be at times, but yeah, providers with the community have a lot of power to progress these things.
And I think what I'd say, just cutting in over here, I mean, I think for me, one of the most powerful things about NZDSN as a network is that knowledge transfer, right? So that ability to share best practice and use the frameworks that have been provided around actually what does good community living in the broader sense look like for members and people to whom people are providing service, right? So one of the things that really struck out at me was, in terms of the paper, was a reduction approaches to service provision. Now paternalistic approaches to service provision can happen in any kind of environment, right? I mean, it can happen in non-disability related care. So for me, there's something about how the network uses the power in terms of knowledge transfer. And look, we're not going to look, more money would be is always lovely. And I think there is something about power of knowledge transfer and best practice. And so that can lead into, I mean, I think one of the things we said when we were thinking about the examination in preparation for it was it shouldn't take the UN to tell us what is the right thing to do. The UN can be a good lever to that, but if the UN is the only kind of lever to change, then yeah, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, I think of the legacy that's been provided to us by people like Sir Robert Martin, the late Sir Robert Martin. And again, while he talked about deinstitutionalisation, what he was really talking about was greater choice and control. The ability to participate in the community, the ability to make some basic decisions in your life about, can I go to the rugby on Saturday, or do I have to go with everyone else from the house that I'm in? So those are things that I think good providers are doing now. Let's acknowledge that. And I think, yeah, as Matt said, there's some things that kind of define the behaviours in institutions. And the thing about big institutions is these things are more likely to happen in big institutions and less likely to happen in smaller ones. And that's isolation and segregation from community life, lack of control over day-to-day decisions, rigidity of routine, identical activities in the same place for a group of persons under a central authority. So, you know, you live with these people and then you go to a day activity with the people. A paternalistic approach in the provision of services and supervision of living arrangements without consent. Kind of those are all kind of negatively based. Turn those into strengths-based statements and you have a wonderful framework to think about how are we doing in this place with these people. And the other good thing about New Zealand is no one can ever get to moving away from institutionalisation without having supported in the community and all the other options that we have about support in the community. So we're well placed to make progress. I think what we don't want to do is say we're there, because there's more that we can do.
And I guess my last point, Debbie, would be, and again, this is where seeing this in a totality in a whole is really helpful. I mean, in the UDHR, there's a really good article, the Universal Declaration, around humans having the right to life, liberty, and security of person. So I guess I'm really mindful, and I know Brian is as well, around the range of provision that members provide. And look, I think there is some really interesting and some really fascinating questions around practice, around how you balance those three things. So I think the other thing that I think is really important in a rights-based framework is the fact that you live. We often think of rights as being kind of, I have rights, right? So I have a right as an individual. Yes, the rights-based frameworks are very much based around individual rights, but they also are connected to I live in a community of which I am a part, right? So I think that is really important in the support context. That there are some complexities of how we unpack some of this stuff. But I think that the general thrust of this is around making sure that people have as much autonomy and as much dignity as they can.
Absolutely. Brian, a question on the chat. Can you unpack the statement supervision of living situations without consent?
Again, I think, let's see this as a continuum. Worst case scenario is every bedroom has a camera. Best case scenario, people pop in every now and again and make sure that things are operating well. So again, I think the best way of considering this and acknowledging that there are risks, but the best way of considering this is, what would we be doing if this was a household of non-disabled people?
Yeah.
So again, there's Sean, there's no absolutes on these things. I think it needs a lot of creativity of individuals and organisations to think about how to progress this. And we won't progress if we do have kind of those paternalistic issues. I mean, the review of the deinstitutionalisation of Kimberley indicated, well, it was quite good that people were participating in more activities in the community. Some of the behaviours of staff that were at Kimberley and then transferred to group homes was still as restrictive as what occurred at Kimberley. So again, it's the challenges around the behaviours of the people involved.
Yeah, great, thank you. We've heard quite a lot about the committee recommending the closure of all institutions of New Zealand in New Zealand. And what does that mean for us in a New Zealand context? And particularly, what does that mean for providers of residential care? Is there a sort of a view that we're still providing institutions in a residential care setting? Is that kind of what does that look and feel like from a UNCRPD perspective?
If I come from what Matt said, and I always learn things from Matt.
Thanks, Brian.
The starting point is we shouldn't be expanding those opportunities. We shouldn't be investing new money into building those things. So we need to consider that. I think you've got a question that says, what would success look like if we progress this? And I'm not planning to be at Geneva in 2030 when we're next examined, which was actually 5 years ago. But if I was there, as a proud New Zealander, I'd be very happy to talk about those things in terms of autonomy, people make decisions, that these things are progressing. And I think talking about those things rather than how many homes we have that have 5 people or 6 people in would be much more meaningful.
And I think what I'd also throw in, Debbie, is part of that observation that often gets missed out is that the committee recommended a comprehensive deinstitutionalisation strategy moving towards, right? So I think it's really important to, like, I think it's really easy to go, oh, well, the committee says that we're going to close certain provision tomorrow, whatever. Look, I think in real terms that and what we learned from environments and examples like Kimberley, right, was you had to do the planning, and you had to do the planning and the careful thought about what that might look like. And Brian and I were talking about this, that I think you can do in terms of the practice, you can do some of the take some of the characteristics and apply them in your own context. So I think one of the slight challenges with the committee kind of structure is it gives implementation observations to state parties, to countries, right? And yes, there are obligations and views on government, and I think there is a real opportunity to do that at the micro level, to do the kind of, okay, so what does, and again, I come back to the progressive realisation aspect here, that there are always opportunities to improve practice. There are always opportunities to look at different ways of working, even in things like having disabled people as part of governance and part of operationalizing how environments do stuff every day, right? Because I think it's, and I actually think, I mean, it's really interesting. I'm doing a master's in human rights through University of London. One of the things I'm exploring is the extent to which this model focuses just on what governments can do, and actually there's a whole range of other actors, of which I think providers are one, who can take actions every day in small ways to you know. And so for me it's about and using the principles of the convention to do that stuff. Now look, I'm not going to sugarcoat the intent, but I think for me it's an ongoing process.
Yeah, I think the other observation to make is the UN provided guidance in 2014, which was really useful, and actually the GLE paper reflects on some of that. They also provided guidance in 2024, and also remembering that our examination was post-COVID. And uppermost in people's mind was the high mortality rate of disabled people who lived in institutions. So I think, you know, quite rightly, that is an issue that I think has spurred the committee into being more strident about the need for the deinstitutionalisation. It's a hard word to say. You know, there's 12 letters in that word.
It really is. It's a really hard word to say.
Spell it when you're writing it either. At any times of my life. Because, you know, look, I think, you know, my experience of NZDSN members is that I haven't spoken to one person that doesn't support the move away from deinstitutionalisation. And in fact, you know, independent living and dignity and autonomy is something that NZDSN members focus on a lot. And I think I speak for our membership when I say we are committed to the convention and we are committed to helping New Zealand realise that. So my final question for our session today is, what can we do to help you and your team keep pushing this excellent work on and moving forward for disabled people?
Well, my first comment would be, and you probably already do this, but when that GLE paper comes out in October, let's meet again and let's meet and see if we can actually develop a community of practice based on that paper, because the paper pulls the experience and observations of all the GLE countries. It recognises the barriers and again, when I was pleasantly surprised at some of the other options and programs that might be put in place that other countries have got operating that actually addresses some of the things that the UN committee is concerned about. So I'm very happy to do under that under GLE. I think the just a reminder that DSS is the leader on this recommendation. Yes. So I'm never one to take over the work of other agencies. So I would suggest once you get a community of practice going, actually starting to have that conversation with DSS and say, hey, this is where we want to go. I know it's hard at the moment, but as we're thinking about the future and our strategic approach around DSS, how do we give effect to this?
I'm also going to slightly contradict my friend and colleague Martin O'Brien, but I do that often. So he's
used to it.
I also think that it's really easy to see the provision of service as being a very narrow kind of construct, right? But I actually think there are opportunities across the convention for members to think about how they can further work, right? So in terms of employment, what are the employment opportunities that are there for people who use service provision provided by NZDSN? What are some of the leisure opportunities that people have? So because the wonderful thing for me about the convention is its breadth. It covers a lot of stuff, and so I think there's opportunities not just in the kind of more traditional DSS space, but also what are some of the skills and attributes that you want to give people who you provide support to increase that autonomy, to increase that sense of dignity and growing capability. So I think there's stuff that we can do at the systemic level, and Brian's already mentioned that, and I think a community of practice would be a fantastic idea. And there's stuff at the micro level. There's stuff at the individual level that members can do every day.
Yeah, and I think that's been my key takeout from this session, which I found really useful. Thank you so much. Is that there's so much that we can be doing on a daily basis to make sure that the environments that disabled people are living in don't reflect institutionalized environments. I mean, and that's what and that's what we can be doing to really help that realization of.
So even something as simple, Debbie, is if I want to watch the cricket, and cricket goes on for a while, how do we make decisions about my access to that, right? And that's playing out the rights, acknowledging that you've got 4 or 5 people living together, right? But that's playing out the rights in the convention in a really practical and powerful way, you know. And I don't underestimate the practice challenge, but also opportunity that lies with that. So yeah.
And we'll keep sorry, Brian, go.
Sorry, Debbie, I think the other thing is also let's see what comes out of the disability strategy in terms of the housing outcome and some of those other outcomes, because they may well be enabling of the things that we're progressing these things.
Absolutely. Great. Okay, well, before we close off, are there any final questions or comments for Brian and Matt? I've just got to scoot through. They're in layers of people because of the numbers. No, there doesn't seem to be any questions following on, and I'm not surprised. It was a excellent korero with you and really, really informative. So thank you for taking the time to come and talk to us. I think the UN CRPD is a very important convention, and one that NZDSN needs to be consistently looking to and making sure that it guides the work that we do as a peak body, as well as the work that our providers do, and also our funders, to make sure that they've also always got those recommendations in sight. So thank you very much. Really appreciate your time. And I will close with the karakia, and we're really keen to come back once that paper comes out and look to establish that community of practice, Brian. I think that's an excellent idea.
Okay, great.
Fantastic.
Okay, all righty. Well, thank you again. Kia whakaria, kia whakaria te tapu, kia watia Aotearoa, kia tu pai ai te mahi a te katoa, huie, takie. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Debbie. Thanks, everyone.